continue back to our story, and thank you, Jim, for walking through the book of Leviticus with us. Very important to see how the Lord and for His holiness, how He is a holy God, and He expects holiness for His people. He can't dwell with sin because He is holy and He doesn't have sin. So it was good to see those connections. We'll touch back on that again, but so when we get back to now, we're going to be going through the book of Joshua. Does everybody have one of those interactive guides? Okay. All right, that's good. Now, again, just want to reiterate: this is not the Bible, right? We are going to be walking through the book of Joshua. In fact, each study has a specific amount of chapters, like Joshua 1 through 4, or study 1 next week. So read Joshua 1 through 4 before you jump into the book. But what is God telling? What is God saying? What is God doing in this book? And then as you seek to answer those questions, then go to your study. I think that's the best way to approach it. My goal is to walk through the scriptures. Now, we can't read 4 chapters of Joshua, or sometimes it's going to be 5, 6, 7. But I like to, as you've seen, I like to at least summarize or walk through, hey, this is what's going on, as we go through each of those questions. So use that as an assist, something to assist you in your study, not as your main form of study. Yeah, so we begin the book of Joshua, but before we talk through that, let's kind of catch up to how we got there. And so the first 5 books of the Old Testament is known as the Torah, or the Pentateuch, and Torah meaning law, and it's comprised of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, if you've been a part of this class for a while, we've walked through Genesis. It took us quite a while, and then we kind of figured out, okay, we gotta go a little quicker than that. But we went through Exodus. That's what we completed last time. Jim taught through a survey of Leviticus, and I'm going to briefly mention Numbers and Deuteronomy in here. So go home and read that as well. But they're all closely linked. Genesis being kind of a standalone, but Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they all kind of flow together. They lock together in terms of the timeline. Like things are happening at the same time in those books. So obviously the first half of Exodus is kind of a standalone narrative. But so let's walk through in the book of Genesis. We see that God existed before anything else, right? And He didn't need anybody, but because of His grace and His love, He created the world and everything in it. Created the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1. And then Genesis 1:31, He says that it is all very good. So there's this harmony. There's this good thing going on. And there's no sin. There's nothing that affects that. But then, as we see, a rebellion happens in heaven. Satan, or Lucifer, is cast down with a third of the angels, and instead of Satan's thought is, I'm going to corrupt God's creation. So we get at the tree, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve first Eve is deceived, and then brings along the husband. But we see that the curse falls on Adam, right? Adam is the one at fault because he was the one that was supposed to steward over and rule, and he was the one that was supposed to shepherd his family, and he fails to do so. So it falls on him, even though the woman was deceived. He didn't properly lead his family. But out of that, out of the fall of man, sin enters the world, but we get a promise from God. 2 of them. 2 motifs that we can follow throughout the Old Testament. Genesis 3:15, we get the seed. The seed of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent. The serpent will bite the heel. So there's going to be a promise of redemption through a seed, which we know is Christ. Christ eventually is that seed. And then arguably we get our first sacrifice where their nakedness, their shame, their sin is covered by something. And so animal covering, something had to die. So it's pointing to that, something covering, atonement of some kind. But then as we go along, that wasn't enough, right? We get the story of Cain and Abel. We really start to see sin play out. There's an acceptable sacrifice offering, right? It's not from the veggies and the fruits of Cain. It's from a sacrifice, right? So God accepts Abel's, but then sin rears its ugly head, right? Cain kills Abel. So, not a good thing, not a good sign. It's starting to flesh itself out in an even deeper and more wicked way. And then sin becomes more increasing, right? It says man becomes increasingly wicked. And so God is going to judge the world. And so we get the flood. In Genesis 9, we get a everlasting covenant. And after the flood, he says he will not judge the world in that way anymore. And the sign of that is a rainbow, right? And then after that, Noah falls, right? He kind of like a great reset. He's at a garden. Like, okay, is this the guy? Well, he gets drunk on his own wine, and his son brings shame upon him in some way. We don't know exactly what happened, other than he sees him naked, and the shame that comes with that. That brings a curse upon Ham's son Canaan. So first be Canaan, Genesis 9:18 through 28. And so things aren't great. We're still awaiting the seed. We're still awaiting redemption. So the Tower of Babel happens. Instead, they're told to be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 1. They're told to be fruitful and multiply again after Noah. Instead of doing that, they just come together and they unite. There's unity. And we think of unity like, yeah, unity is a good thing. But when you're unified in sin and rebellion and revolution, that's actually complete disobedience. And that's exactly what's going on. They're trying to build a tower to the heavens, that one that could rival God. And what does God do? He comes down to them. Comes down to them, and he scatters them. He confuses their language. And that is, people are scattered. And out of that, it begins the patriarchal period with Abraham, or Abram at the time. And he establishes an everlasting covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17, 7 through 8, and verse 19, that he will, that they will be a nation. And if he said to look at the stars and count them, and that's how many people I will bring out of you. And he believes, and it's counted to him as righteousness, faith, right? And so circumcision is the sign of this covenant. And we get the promise of that, if we look in Romans 4, that the promise of faith, which precedes the law, the Mosaic covenant, that we are included in that. It's a promise for those who believe. And now, it's not about circumcision physically, it's about a circumcision of the heart. So we get a picture of that right there. Then we see Isaac is the chosen son from Abraham. He's told he's going to have a child, and Sarah laughs. And so Isaac, which means laughter, comes out of this. And it's not Ishmael. You know, he talked about doing Hagar ministry, right? It's where you try to bring your own will to the table. But it's always God's will that's going to prevail. And whenever we go outside of God's will to do it in our own strength, it's usually going to fail. So Isaac is part of the seed promise, the seed motif, as we follow that. And then Jacob and Esau, we see Jacob's deception, which leads to him getting the birthright. But it's Jacob being used. And he wrestles with God, right? Wrestles with the angel of the Lord. And his hip socket, dislocates his hip. and he is called, renamed Israel. So we see that the seed is going through Jacob. And then that the 12 tribes of Israel will eventually come out of Jacob. And then now Joseph, we get the story of him. Remember, he's betrayed by his brothers. He is sold into slavery. And he's faithful throughout the whole time. I mean, he's getting his rear end handed to him. But the Lord is with him. The Lord is providing for him. The Lord is giving him favor, even in the midst of trial. But then we find out, well, Joseph is not actually where the seed is going to come from, where the seed of the Messiah. It's actually, we find out in Genesis 49, that it's Judah. So Judah will be the nation in which Christ would be born out of. So, but that's important. The story of Joseph is important because they end up in Egypt, and there's a 400-year period of them there. And so their nation's growing, they're multiplying. Where they were a small group of people, the brothers are now growing into a great nation, even though they're not at the place where they're supposed to be. In fact, they have the favor, right? Their things are going well seemingly until they're not. And then they're in slavery, and they're building for them 2 cities. So Exodus now, we get to the book of Exodus, and it begins with God's covenant promise still unfolding, right? He's got a covenant that he made with Abraham. He's not going to go back against that. And so the descendants of Jacob, they're multiplying, and then a new Pharaoh arrives that has forgotten. It says that he has forgotten, they're ignorant of Joseph and what has happened or transpired before that. And he enslaves Israel, and he tries to kill their sons. Remember, throw them into the Nile. Well, Moses is preserved during that period. He's raised in Pharaoh's household, and he kills a guy that he sees one of his brothers being mistreated, so he kills one of the Egyptians, and then he sees, oh, people saw that, and I got to get out of town. In fact, Pharaoh wanted to kill him. So he leaves, he goes to Midian, and then God shows up again. God hears the cry of Israel. They're crying out, hey, we are enslaved, God help us. But it took 400 years for Israel to say, Lord, we need you. And you'll see that pattern all throughout the Old Testament. It's a period, they're up and down. It's like a roller coaster going up and down. The book of Judges, they're acting in disobedience, and then they cry out. God brings a judge to help them. Over and over. So in this case, this is what happens. God shows up. God shows up in the form of a burning bush, his glory, a fire. He says, he reveals his name as the great I am, the all-encompassing God. He's the most powerful. He is all things. And we see it through the plagues, right? He tells them, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Right? And what does Pharaoh do? He hardens his heart, right? And in hardening his heart, the Lord also hardens his heart. Gives him exactly, when you want to disobey me, I will give you exactly what you are desiring. So Pharaoh does not let God's people go. Over and over, the different plagues, they keep coming. The God signs that are more powerful, resembling the name of God, I am. And he does. All the gods that Egypt worshipped, the Lord had an answer for, and prevailing over them. You can trace actually each of because they believed in many gods, you can trace the various gods that they worshipped and how God overpowered them through his plagues. And then a final plague, a final sign in which God would deliver Israel is through the Passover. So they would a sacrifice, they would have to take the blood of the animal and put it on the doorpost and the lintel, and God would pass over those who had the blood on their doorstep, or on their door, on the door. So Pharaoh's son is killed, and this is the final nail in the coffin in which he says, okay, you guys can go. And so he relents until he doesn't, right? They leave, they pillage Egypt. Egypt is convinced, like, get your God out of here. Take all our stuff too if you want. And so they walk away even richer. Israel is a nation, a larger nation at this point, where they have grown in number and multiplied, and they exit. Exodus, going out, right? That's where we get that from. And so we get the parting of the Red Sea, Egypt's army, they're destroyed, Pharaoh's destroyed, they're overcome by the waters, God's final miracle, the waters are parted, and they walk right through to the other side on dry ground. And then Israel is delivered out of slavery, but what does Israel do when they're in the wilderness? They grumble, right? They complain. It'd be better if we were still in Egypt, where we were at least being fed 3 times a day. So, despite God working and showing himself to his people, they still reject him. Sin is still a problem, right? Sin has not went away. And so God at Mount Sinai, he gives Moses the 10 Commandments and additional laws, forming Israel into a covenant nation. So God's promise is still moving forward, right? If you have a nation, you see in the end, you need people, law, and land. So now God has built a people up in Egypt. They have greatly multiplied, and now he's giving them law at Mount Sinai. This is how you are to be governed. This is how you're going to live. This is how you're going to be a distinct nation. And so only the promised land remains, which the Lord said he would give to Abraham and his descendants. And Joshua will later complete this mission. So God confirms the covenant, but Israel, they break it. How do they break the covenant right away? Yeah, they raise up the golden calf, right? They're impatient. It's Aaron. He's the one, he relents, right? He may not even have trusted, like, that's probably a bad idea, but these people are coming against me. Like, I'm just a man of the people. So they raise up a golden calf, and they worship that. They break the covenant right away. God's ready to destroy it, all of them. But Moses intercedes, right? The covenant is renewed, and the tabernacle is built, which means to dwell, right? We know that God tabernacles in us now because of the work of Jesus Christ and us having the Holy Spirit now. We see that connection there. We see the connection to the temple as well. The tabernacle is basically a portable temple, like portable Mount Sinai, a place where God's glory dwells. Through fire, right? And on their journey, the tabernacle moves with them. So that's the significance of that. And this book shows God's faithfulness ultimately through the whole thing. The seriousness of sin when they reject God and they raise up that idol, and they need a faithful leader, right? It's constant. Moses is that for them during that time. He's the one that intercedes. He's the one at the tent of meeting. But we also see that somebody else is also with him at the tent of meeting. Somebody else is with Moses at Mount Sinai. And that's Joshua. Joshua is God is beginning to raise and train Joshua to succeed Moses in his role in being a leader, a faithful leader. And so Jim, last week in the book of Leviticus, it's a continuation of this story. It's not narrative as much as it is movements, as he had talked about. It's more about movements rather than just a list of rules and law. So it is mainly a book about worship. So this is it. So God has given Moses the law to give to the people. They got a place where God can dwell again with humanity. But because of sin, it's limited now. Because if you were in the presence of God's glory, you would die right away. Right? So, this book, and so Leviticus is now, we get the movements in which God's holiness is provided for them. God says that He calls Israel to be holy just as He is holy. And the central book, or the central theme of the book, is holiness. So Israel's is to fulfill the covenant responsibility to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So that's why there's very specific laws as a means of protection for them, as a means to make them a distinct nation, different from the surrounding nations, different from the standards of the world. And so that's what God is doing in this book. And so Exodus, being the introduction of the law through the Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, the 2 tablets, which God would dwell with them, and Leviticus is the execution of that law. So it is a further unfolding of the divine-human relationship codified on Mount Sinai, and the way in which God would dwell with His people. And so Israel, though, right, they're sinful, but God addresses the sin through the book of Leviticus. And because of transgression, He gives them, they are given the law. And so Leviticus describes how to deal with sin and impurity so that God can dwell with His people. And then we get to the book of Numbers, and that details the narrative of Israel in the wilderness. So this is resembled with that picture there. It was 40 years. They were just circling the wagons. This journey. And this is the gradual fulfillment of the promises to Abraham and his descendants, right? The covenant is still there. God is faithful in delivering on that promise. So this is a continuation of that story as well. God's presence being with them in the tabernacle, right? Following them where they went, would follow them. But we see unbelief with Israel in this book. They fail to trust God. They continue to grumble, they continue to complain, and it delays the entry for them into the promised land. In fact, an entire generation is not going to enter into the promised land.
You know what's interesting, there's only one set of bones from that generation that will go into the promised land. One set of bones.
Joshua. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of Joseph, or his bones.
Oh, actually, yeah, I got you. Yeah, Joseph was buried and they were told to carry his bones to the promised land. Yep. So, even though God had delivered them out of slavery, they still grumbled and complained, and they still, hey, God, why do you have us in this situation? Even though God was providing for them manna and quail and water, they still complained. And at the end of the book, Israel would be at the cusp of entering into the promised land. It said they're at the outer banks of the Jordan right before we get to the book of Joshua. And that's where they're at that point. And this is the thing here. So Exodus introduces the law. Leviticus is the execution of the law. And in this book, we still see more laws introduced as well. So Moses is giving more laws and adding to it. And we also see in this book a couple stories, and I want to point out why there is that. This is a serpent on a post. So I'll explain a little bit about that as well. So this is why Moses cannot enter the promised land. He strikes the rock twice in disobedience. The result of that is that Moses and Aaron would not go into the promised land. They would have to struggle in the wilderness as well. Aaron eventually dies while they're out there. They both do, but Aaron before Moses. And then in Numbers 21, 4 through 9, God instructs Moses to create a bronze serpent to mount it onto a pole. So whoever looked at the bronze serpent who was bitten by a serpent would be healed. And so this is referenced in John chapter 3, verses 14 through 15, with Jesus being lifted up, just as the bronze serpent was. So if we look upon Jesus on a cross, being on a pole, we will be healed spiritually. Those of you will be born again. 1 second. Let's click myself out of there. And so, those who look upon Jesus by faith will be born again, will be healed in that way. And then Deuteronomy. Get to the book of Deuteronomy. It's the sequel to Numbers. And we have Moses expounding on the law and urging Israel to obey. So Deuteronomy is a retelling. Deutero means two, second telling of the law. It's largely a sermon by God given to Moses to remind Israel of God's faithfulness in making them a nation with people, giving them law. So more laws are given in this book, and how God is going to bring them into the promised land to fulfill his will, the covenant. And now Israel, they have failed, right? They failed because of their sin, because of their idolatry, their grumbling, their complaining. But God has remained faithful. That's what we're always going to see here, is God is faithful even though man is not. So Israel, though, they're stiff-necked, right? They are just as much entwined with sin as we all were, and still struggle with sin today. So Moses, in his sermon, his large sermon, he emphasizes the law that Israel would be convinced of God's faithfulness. And we see all kinds of laws. It covers all areas of life for the nation. Let's see here. In this book of Deuteronomy, it concludes the Pentateuch. So it's basically, even though it's no, it does include, and it brings together the patriarchal promises. So what was promised to Abraham in Genesis 17, the everlasting covenant, they got their law, they got their people, they got a law, and they're about to get their land. So Moses is preparing the people for that. This is how, when we read after Deuteronomy, and which we're starting in Joshua, we get to the historical books that follow. So Joshua through 1st and 2nd Kings, we can look at Deuteronomy, we can look at the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and that provides a framework for how to read Joshua through 1st and 2nd Kings. So when we read through, when we preached through Judges, we could see where the nation has fallen short and where God had trusted them to trust in him, and they forget a generation or two after, right? So we look back, like, they forgot all of this. They were supposed to remember that. They were supposed to be faithful and continue to dwell in the land that God had given them. But they instead intermingled with other nations and pagan gods, and they are falling downhill. And at the end of Deuteronomy, we get Joshua commissioned as the next leader to Moses. And then Moses dies at the end of the book, just before Israel enters the promised land. And so now we get to the book of Joshua. Flip this.
I just love that flipping
We
thing.
love that. We love that. It wakes you up too. Because this is more of a lecture today, but it'll be more interactive the next several weeks. So how did we get to Joshua? Well, I'm going to trace kind of Joshua's leadership, how he was chosen shortly here, but I want to just get to the book of it and talk through a couple things. Again, it's the beginning of the historical books in the Old Testament, and they tell the story of Israel's entry into the promised land of Canaan under the leadership of Joshua. It's Israel's life in the land under the judges, so going beyond that, beyond the book of Joshua, and they're looking for a king, essentially. They're awaiting a king. And now we preach through Judges, like I mentioned. I preached on Malachi, that period, that's the last book of the Old Testament, and how Israel is expecting a king. They're looking for that king, and how Elijah would come, being John the Baptist, would point us to the new king. So that's why we're preaching in Matthew right now. The king is here. The king is here in his beauty. Then later in the Old Testament, we get the division of the nation into two rival kingdoms, Israel and Judah, and the life of them after that. And then later, the downfall and exile for each kingdom, and their life during the exile, Judah's return from exile. Give Judah being the line of the seed. And so the book of Joshua doesn't mention explicitly that Joshua is the author, but the Talmud, which is a collection of rabbinic Jewish texts that record oral history and the oral tradition of the early rabbis, they ascribe authorship to Joshua for this book, other than his death. Right? He didn't write about his death. But, so we can pretty strongly say Joshua is the one who wrote this book. Basically picked up the notebook from Moses and kept going. So, the story of Joshua is basically, even though it's the start of the historical books, it's the completion of the Pentateuch. We see the conclusion of what God had promised all Genesis through Deuteronomy. We see that conclusion there, even though it's not technically that. And so now, how did Joshua, why is it Joshua? Well, we see God directing Joshua's steps. We see God directing Israel, and all throughout you keep seeing, like I mentioned, this little Joshua's next to Moses. Joshua's at the tent of meeting with Moses. Joshua's on the mountain with Moses. He's right alongside of Moses. And how God is preparing him every step of the way for this transition. So here's the step-by-step. So in Exodus, Joshua first appears. He's his assistant. He's a military leader. In Exodus 17, 9 through 14, he leads Israel's army against Amalek. So remember, this is Moses. He's praying while Joshua fights, his hands being raised, and God gives the victory. So whenever Moses held his hand up, they would prevail over Amalek. And whenever his hand would get tired or weird, he'd get weary and he'd drop his hand, Amalek would prevail. Eventually, Aaron and Hur are holding his hands up, and they win, but Joshua is leading that battle. Joshua is close to Moses, as I mentioned. He's his assistant. He's called his assistant. He goes partway up to Mount Sinai with them. He's also near the tent of meeting. So Exodus shows Joshua as a trusted assistant, a loyal, God-fearing man who's set apart for God. And in Leviticus, Joshua's not mentioned at all. But this period, when they're getting the law, he would have been informed. It would have helped him to understand his role to be a leader, helped him to understand why God is giving them these laws, that they are to be a holy people, to be set apart from God, or set apart for God, and him leading, and God leading them. In Numbers, there's a spy mission in Numbers 13 and 14, where Joshua and Caleb are among the 12 spies sent to scout out Canaan. It's Joshua who is faithful, and the rest spread fear, leading to 40 years of wandering. So Joshua is the only one he recognizes. And Joshua's faith sets him apart from the rest of his generation. So it's clearly God using one guy at this point. God is building up Joshua to be the next guy. And then in Numbers 27, he is publicly commissioned. So he tells Moses to appoint Joshua as the new leader, laying hands on him before Eleazar, the priest, and the people. Joshua is described as having the Spirit with him at this point. So Numbers publicly identifies Joshua as the next leader, as the successor for Israel after Moses. And then Deuteronomy, Moses is preparing Joshua and Israel, right? The sermon. He's giving this large sermon that's going to help prepare Joshua and his people for the handoff. So in Deuteronomy 138 and 328, Moses is told to strengthen Joshua. Who will lead Israel to the promised land, the next step, right? He tells Joshua before all to be strong and courageous because God's going to be with him. And it says that Joshua's full of the spirit of wisdom. And then this is the final transition for Israel, from Moses to Joshua. And God's blessing and the people's acknowledgement that Joshua is the next guy. This is where we get that. And so, to summarize, Joshua proves himself in battle in Exodus. The Lord is with him, and he's loyal to Moses. He's next to Moses. Joshua in Leviticus, again, these aren't separate. These all flow together, these 4 books. But when they're given the law in Leviticus, Joshua is absorbing, he's seeing God's holiness. He's seeing what the leadership standards are. He's growing in that way. In the book of Numbers, his faith is tested, and Joshua prevails, and God names him at this point as the successor. And then in Deuteronomy, Moses charges Joshua, and God affirms him, and the people accept his leadership. And so this is where we are at, and next week we're going to continue to just walk through. And so, again, the key to all of this is to read through Joshua. The first study, I think, is Joshua 1 through 4. Read the first 4 chapters. Be familiar with it. Then go to your study, your interactive study, as an aid, as an assist, something to assist you in helping you to understand it. So does anyone have any questions or thoughts or comments? I just did a long lecture, which can be kind of boring sometimes. Yes?
It was something that you mentioned. You said that you had preached or taught Malachi, the last book.
Yeah, not the whole book. I preached on one section.
When was that?
That was last year, and right around Christmas. It actually flowed just right because on the week of Christmas, that was the first, or it was the second sermon. It was when Jesus was born. It actually flowed just right. Yep. Yep. Detailing the prophecy that the Messiah will come and that Elijah will prepare the way, both with John the Baptist and at the end of days, Elijah will come back. So, you got something? You sure? You can share it if you want.
No, that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
I had a question.
Yeah.
To do with Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
I was a little confused. I think I understand it, but I would not say 100%. In chapter 7, verse 3 through 4, and then chapter 21, 10 through 13, it almost seems a contradiction.
3 through 4 and Deuteronomy 7.
Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters from
Yeah.
your sons, so that will turn away your children from following me to serve other gods.
Yeah.
And then in 21, verse 10 through 13, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God hands them over to you, and you take them captive, suppose you see among the captives a beautiful woman whom you desire and want to marry, and he approves that under certain conditions.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Yeah. I don't know if I got the answer for you right now.
I'm wondering if it's because, well, I think it has to do with distance, like area, physical distance, maybe, proximity, distance.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Honestly, the only thing I could say is, again, there's a reason why the Lord has instituted a law like this. Like it's, yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if this is
Yeah.
correct, so,
Yeah,
you know, it'd have to be researched, but I had heard in the past that people, when they were out for battle, the higher rank would take the men, and opposed to taking the men, they were asked to take the woman instead.
The lower rank would take a woman.
The men would sleep with the woman instead of another man, cause they were away from the women for so long. I don't know, that's what I heard. Yeah.
yeah. Anyone have an answer for that?
Well, strangers could become Jews, so to speak.
Yeah,
They would get circumcised. And that would be a mark that they're believers. Now, women don't have the similar mark, but there is proselytism, that one could recognize the true and the living God.
yeah,
And I can't imagine that there's actually a contradiction,
Right.
that there's
Yeah.
a process that, that would have to, one would have to go through to become a Jew.
yeah. Well, and then as I read the last couple verses of that little section there, it's really about, they aren't to mistreat them. That's part of it. It's like a law against them mistreating them as well, because it says, after that you may go in her and be your husband, that she shall be your wife. So she's agreeing to be a Jew, so as he's saying. And then it says, but if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. So if she wants to leave, right? We kind of see a similar in 1 Corinthians. If an unbelieving spouse wants to leave, they are free to go, and you're not bound to that covenant anymore. And then after that, but you shall not sell her for money, so this, don't mistreat her, don't sell her, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you humiliated her. So it's kind of a protection for God, for people, and that, an image bearer in that respect.
I was kind of thinking, because when I got done reading that, pondering it, kind of what Jim said, it seems as though in verse 7, he's talking about those that would never be believers, and that's why you get rid of them.
Yeah.
Destroy them all.
Yeah.
Whereas, when we get to chapter 21,
Yeah.
there's almost like this exception for those that will believe in the Lord God.
Yeah.
That's how I kind of.
Yeah, and a protection for them as well as people, which is, yeah, we see basically the Ten Commandments, the heart of the Ten Commandments, loving God and loving other people. It's kind of what starts to come out of these other laws, these more intricate laws, these more specific marrying female captives, right? Like we're not going to be dealing with that in our life right now, but they did at that time. So the Lord had a specific law to address that. That makes sense.
There's probably a good example with Ruth and Naomi, where Ruth, your God will become my God.
Yeah.
And
Rahab.
yeah,
Yes, Rahab. Yep.
In the line of Jesus.
Cool. Anyone else have any other comments or suggestions or things they want to add before we close? Prayer. Remember, we're looking to Christ. We're looking to Christ in all of this. And the Old Testament points us to Jesus and Him being the fulfillment of ultimately God's covenant promises to Israel. And He's fulfilled because He is the seed that came to the world. He is the promise of faith given to Abraham. He does fulfill the law completely and perfectly because He's holy. He didn't inherit the curse of Adam because he was born from a virgin. We go down the line and Jesus fulfilled every prophecy, everything that's said about who the Messiah was supposed to be. Jesus fulfilled it and lived it out. He died on the cross, was buried and rose again. And now that continues through the church, us. So we have a role to play in the story. We are put here. We have purpose to point others to Christ, point the world to look what Jesus has done. Oh, you don't like reading the Old Testament? Look what he did in the Old Testament. Look what that points to. It points to history of redemption. Jesus came to this world, was perfect, died, rose again, he ascended into heaven. He's one day coming back to judge the world. So time is short. Doesn't feel like it is, but time is short. And our lives on this earth are very, very short. We're all eschatological. We all have an end times view because our time ends pretty quickly. We're like a vapor, 1 minute gone the
Time
next.
has been short for 2,000 years.
That's right. That's why it's so urgent. Right away, the first century church is urgent about the return of Christ. So that's what we get, that's the role we get to play. We're part of the story that the Lord has shown us time and time again. So let's close in prayer. Jesus, we are so grateful to be here and see your word come alive. They're not just random stories or random things that random people put together, Lord. They are a story that is perfectly interwoven and aligned to show us your glory, God, just like you demonstrated and showed your glory at Mount Sinai, at the burning bush and the tabernacle, and ultimately through your Son, Jesus. Lord, we help us to trust, to believe, to point others to that, to fulfill the Great Commission, Lord. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. See you guys next week.